Hey, econ students, Mr. P here, and today we're going to do economic systems. That's the name of today's lecture. So you should have a handout that I gave out earlier in the week, and it should look like this. If for some reason I should say economic systems on there. If for some reason you don't have this, pause the video right now and go down to see my substitute teacher, and he should have some extra copies there for you. So we're going to jump right into today's lesson on economic systems. And here we go. So economic systems. And so economic systems, countries are going to have different governments, but they're also going to have different ways that the economy is organized to answer the three basic economic questions. Now, these questions came up last week when we were discussing opportunity costs and opportunity benefits and so forth, but and the one reading that you had in class. But the three basic economic questions are what to produce, how to produce, and who consumes what is produced. In other words, who gets it. And so we're going to address the first one, what to produce. So these are all about a country's trade-offs. So what are we going to produce? What is going to give the country the most benefit at the least cost? And so there are trade-offs. So for example, uh, we use an old phrase in economics called guns versus butter. And guns and butter symbolize either military items or non-military items, or as I have listed here, consumer goods versus the protection of your country, military goods. And consumer goods basically is everything that is not military. What is military? Well, it's money spent on soldiers, tanks, planes, weapons, missiles, et cetera, et cetera. And a country is going to have these trade-offs. Like, for example, North Korea. North Korea is not a particularly rich country, but they have a very strong military. They have nuclear weapons because a vast amount of that country's resources are used on protection, the military, the guns, so to speak. And because they spend so much of their country's resources on guns, they have very little left for the butter. So that's why when you see pictures, documentaries, news stories about North Korea, it's a very poor country. In essence, if they could recategorize their priorities, their trade-offs, they could spend a lot more of their resources on quote unquote butter, uh, things like food, tables, chairs, clothing, homes, non-military sorts of things. Japan, on the other hand, is a very wealthy country, but also they prioritize the butter. After World War II, by treaty, Japan, between the United States and Japan, you remember the whole dropping the bomb, World War II, Pearl Harbor, the attack on the United States. We dropped the atomic bombs on two of them on Japan, and they surrendered. And after that surrender, the treaty that was signed by Japan basically dictated that Japan doesn't have much of an army anymore, indefinitely. And they do have a ceremonial, very small army and military. You know, there are some generals, but basically nothing to speak of, nothing huge to really speak of. They don't spend a lot of their money on guns, and therefore that frees up a lot of their resources for butter. So who makes some of the best electronics in the world? Uh, Japan does. And, so Japan, within that agreement, we also have to now protect Japan. We made them sign a treaty that says they will be very limited in their production of military goods. And so therefore they're like, if you're telling us that we can't protect ourselves, then who's going to protect us? And so we were obligated to protect, and still are obligated to protect Japan. And so that's why we've got Army, Air Force bases, Navy bases all throughout Japan and its many islands. We look at this trade-off that a country might experience or go through, and we call it the guns versus butter theory. That the more guns, the less butter you can make, and vice versa. The more butter, the less guns that you can make. And this is, this can be transferred to any part of one's life, a country's life, or an individual's life. I grabbed this cartoon off the internet. It's kind of neat. It just, it shows this guy pointing a gun and trying to rob him of his butter. As Ken handed over his butter, you cannot help thinking about his Economics 101 class from college. The theory goes that if you could only produce one or the other, guns or butter, what should you choose? Now, logic would say, well, if I just produced military items and guns, we'd be a very poor country and everybody would starve. So we can't produce just guns. So we should just produce butter. And logic would dictate, that if you could only put resources toward one and not the other, a country would choose butter. But if you really think about that and take some in-depth look at that proposition, if all 192 countries of the world produced butter and we had global peace, then it would work. It would be great. But all it would take is just one country to produce guns. And guess what? They're not only going to have guns, but they're going to have everybody's butter, like you see in the picture. They're simply going to take the butter. So they'll spend 1 unit of resource on guns, and they'll get several units of production out of guns and butter. If we simplify it down to just 2 countries, here's the dilemma. Here's the paradox. If you simply have 2 countries and they could spend 1 resource on either guns or butter, if one country if both countries produce butter, that's great. We live happily ever after. If both countries produce guns, there's going to be death because they're either going to starve to death or they're going to shoot one another. All right. And if one country produces guns and one country produces butter, then what you have is a situation where the country that produced butter is going to have nothing because the country that produced guns are going to have guns and they're going to take your butter. And so they'll have both guns and butter. All right, this is the idea that many people have said that, it's very naive to think that we would ever have global peace at any time in the future. Right now, there are so many hot spots. When I say hot spots in the world, there are so many places where there are war, civil wars, there is conflict, there is military coups. Just in the news the other day, the country of Myanmar, near Thailand, just went through a military coup. We talked about that in government class earlier in the year. So a country, pretty much has to produce a little bit of guns and a little bit of butter. And, in the case of Japan, lots of butter and very little guns. Or in the case of North Korea, another Asian country, lots of guns and very little butter, depending on what your trade-offs are. So how do we produce them? You look at these pictures on this particular slide here, and you've got an American farmer with the best technology, the best tractors, and then you've got a farmer in India and the technology that they're using. How efficient are we? What is the newest technology? Does the government produce, or do private individuals produce? Who's making those decisions? These are questions we're going to answer. Who consumes what is produced? And we just had our lesson yesterday on the 4 factors of production. And the question here is, who owns the factors of production? And how much do the workers get paid? Do they get paid by the government or do they get paid by a private company? How do the goods get distributed to those customers? And are people free to choose what they can buy? So for example, the picture in the bottom right of this slide is a bread line at literally a bread store, a bakery in the former Soviet, well, it wasn't a Soviet country, but it was controlled by the communist Czechoslovakia, which is now 2 countries, Czech Republic and Slovakia. and the government ran and runs the economy under communism. And so the government has government bread stores, and they're very, very inefficient in producing and manipulating and managing the four factors of production. Well, one factor would not be in communism, and that's entrepreneurship. And so what you end up with is bread lines, and they make decisions not on what the people want, but what the government thinks should happen. So, for example, in this particular bread line in Czechoslovakia, the people, they're going to get in this long line, and they're going to get their bread. Maybe it might run out. There might be a surplus. There might be a shortage, but they're going to get their choice between maybe white bread and pumpernickel, and that's about it. Right? The government makes those choices, and so the government doesn't think we should have 50 styles of bread. If you've ever walked down the bread aisle at Walmart, I mean, literally, you've got probably 15 or 20 different brand names. And then out of the 15 or 20 brand names of bread, you've got white, wheat, white light, wheat light. You've got pumpernickel. You've got rye bread, all different types of bread, because the consumers dictate what gets produced and who gets those items rather than the government. And so the who consumes what is produced is another question that we're going to attempt to answer. While we're attempting to answer these, we have to really question this idea of economic equality versus freedom. Political equality is unquestioned. We don't, as Americans or most people in the world, think that people should politically be free and equal. We should treat white people, black people, women, females the same. That's political equality. Economic equality is, should we treat everybody the same economically, monetarily? Should everybody own equal property? Should we abolish private property rights? Should the government own all property and then everybody shares like in communism? Should we have the freedom to pursue wealth, or should be everybody forced to be economically equal? We're humans. We have different levels of work ethic. We have different levels of intelligence and strength. And so if I magically could give every student in my class $10,000 one day, you'd be economically equal. Well, that's great. A little bit utopian, sure, everybody's equal. But 2 days later, everybody's not going to be equal because we live in a free country. And so one person might take their $10,000 and invest it in a hot dog cart and double their money. Now they've got $20,000. Another person might go out and waste their money on stupid stuff, drugs, alcohol, whatever. And so 2 days later, the smart guy's got 20,000 and the dumb guy's got zero. And so should we attempt as a government to intervene again and make them equal, take from the rich guy and give half to the poor guy after he dwindled away his $10,000? Should the government always be there to continue to force us to be economically equal? The only way we do that is without freedom. If we have freedom, we're going to be unequal. People are going to do different things. They're going to work harder. They're going to work less hard. They're going to have more intelligence. They're going to have less intelligence. They're going to have more education. They're going to have less education. This gets, we can take this in a lot of different directions. You see the bottom two questions. Should we, this is a question that the Democrats and Republicans debate all the time in our government. Should we make sure that everyone has equal health care? All right, that's a question I'm going to throw back on you. Is health care a personal responsibility, or is this a right that the government should provide for everybody equally? I'm not making a judgment. I'm asking you. Free college. We have free school up to 12th grade. Should we provide that beyond 12th grade into college for all citizens? Got discussed the pros and cons of each one of those. We're not going to do that at this very moment, but these are some questions we need to take a good look at. So economists will say that there are basically four types of economic systems. The first one is really not a significant one, the traditional economy. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And we got the market economy, the command economy, and the mixed economy. Depending on the textbook, depending on the YouTube video, you will see those three, market, command, and mix, under different titles, called slightly different things, or you'll see some of the traditional names for those, and I'll explain those in just a moment. The video for economic systems here from the Crash Course series, I'm going to attach to an asynchronous lesson that we'll watch either today or next class period. So let's look at the traditional economy. Let's get this one out of the way. It's one we're not going to really deal with, but traditional economy is also called the tribal economy. In a tribal economy, it's very, very rudimentary, very simple. In a tribal economy, you don't specialize, and you do basically everything that your family needs. So you look at the picture of this guy who's probably from South America or Africa, and then you've got an Amish farm in the picture on the right. And with these, if an Amish family wants a table, then dad builds it. If they want food, they grow it. If they, need clothing, then mom will sew it, so to speak, no pun intended. And so everybody gets good at doing a lot of different things. But you don't get really good and specialize and become super good at one particular thing. There's an old saying, they used to say, if you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. You can get good at a lot of things, but you can't get great at one thing. All right. And one of the highlights of capitalism is, and one of the reasons why you're going to eventually pick one occupation someday, is you're going to get really good at that. And that's going to provide you with your livelihood. Traditional economies have very little innovation nor any need to innovate. And see, as you can see, some even modern tribes, they're getting along fine. Dad hunts or fishes or whatever. Mom does the domestic chores, and they're fine. If he needs food or something to be repaired, then they just simply do it. They don't trade for it. There's very little trade. The basic family units in traditional economies provide for themselves for the most part. We're not going to really get into traditional economies. We're going to cover these other larger types of economies. The first one is called the market economy. And you'll see other textbooks will call it the free market economy, or the most popular name for it is capitalism. Excuse me. Keys to the market economy is private citizens are allowed to own private property. In capitalism, if I wanted to buy a truck and buy some land and build a garage and start my own snow plowing company, I have the right to do that if I have the money, the capital to do that. In communist countries, you can't do that. You don't have private ownership of property. Specialization and competition are other hallmarks of a market economy. If somebody wants to compete with me and open up their own snow plowing company, they're welcome to do that. And the more competition I have, the better I have to be at what I do, or I can charge less. So with competition, it causes the producers, the companies, to provide you the best product at the lowest possible cost. If I've got 3 other companies competing with my snowplow company, and I'm making good money at this point, but now I'm starting to lose customers to my competitor, I'm either going to have to do a better job than they are, or I'm going to have to cut my prices. Specialization means, hey, I'm not going to just do this part-time. I'm going to do this 100% of the time. I'm going to get really good at what I do. And then all the other things in my life will be provided through trade. We just did the trading simulation the other day, and we see how trade builds wealth. So for example, I went to school to train to be a teacher. My entire livelihood is based on me specializing and becoming the best teacher that I can be. I'm not like the Amish gentleman where if he wants a steak, he's going to go out and kill a cow. All right. If I want a steak, I'm going to just take my paycheck. I'm going to continue to specialize and become the best teacher I can be to make the most money that I can, and then use that money to provide for my family without slaughtering cows or growing vegetables and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, market economies get a bad name because of these two other characteristics, profit motive and self-interest. Adam Smith, the famous philosopher, he was in your vocabulary terms. He implied that self-interest and greed were almost good characteristics because the more you look out for yourself, the better society benefits. I know that sounds counterintuitive, illogical, but the idea is because of specialization and competition, I'm looking out for myself, but my customers and the other customers are getting cheaper and cheaper snow plowing and better quality snow plowing because I'm looking out for myself. I don't want to lose customers, I'll lose money. And the only way that I can help you out is by getting better at what I do. So also, profit motive. With a profit motive, why does the capitalist do anything? Well, they do something to make money. In a communist country, they don't have profit motive. The government does everything. And so, matter of fact, the idea of a market economy is that we want to have limited government, that the more government involvement, the more inefficient the economy becomes. There's a French term I want you to all write down. It's laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically means hands off. Government, stay out of the economy. Adam Smith would call it the invisible hand theory. The invisible hand theory is this idea that if the government just stays out of the economy, that everything will fix itself. So for example, my snow plowing example, if the government could make all kinds of rules on the snow plowing guys, or the government can just keep their hands off. And what happens when we have specialization, competition, and communication, if one snow plowing dude and his company screw up, then word's going to get out and I'll go out of business. And the rest of them will try to avoid the mistakes that I made. If I were doing bad things, then I should be driven out of business. Under capitalism, if you're a company that's doing bad things, you will be driven out of business. And that's the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand theory, that if the government just stays out, that the mechanisms of the market will fix themselves. When you see some of these TV shows, like The Amazing Race on CBS, and they visit these foreign countries, and you see these foreign markets, and people are just, competing with one another, and the customers are going to get the best product at the cheapest price. If I'm selling potatoes down here, and a little bit further down, somebody else is selling potatoes, these customers are going to quickly realize I got my choice of the best potatoes at the cheapest price. And it forces these producers, these farmers over here, to produce the best potatoes at the cheapest price, or they're going to go out of business. The market will correct itself by sending me out of business. We literally have thousands and thousands of corporations and businesses in the world. And these are not the government running things. If we were to turn to a communist country like North Korea, they have none of this. The government does all of this. Well, part of this, like North Korea is not going to have credit cards or Hard Rock cafes and so forth. But, the different ways that you satisfy consumers will all be done by the government, rather than these entities that are being driven by greed and making lots of money, which again seems a little unseemly that they're driven by greed, but this greed and competition provides us, the consumers, with the best products at the cheapest prices. Some sample market economies, United States, obviously, Singapore is one I mentioned in class the other day, Hong Kong, Luxembourg. There's quite a few market economies in the world. And, a great example of, you take two competing restaurant chains like Qdoba and Chipotle, and, they may even be, a block away, and they better be on their, providing the best and freshest food for the customer at the best price, or everybody's going to just switch to the other one and cause you to lose money or go out of business. And so these are some of the benefits of a market economy. The exact opposite end of the spectrum is the command economy. The command economy gets its name because the government commands the economy. It controls the economy. Some textbooks will use the term centrally planned economies because, like, for example, in the old former Soviet Union, probably the first and most famous communist country in the world, there was a central planning committee, and the central planning committee would decide those economic questions. What's going to get made? How's it going to get made? I used to have a Russian student when I taught at Kirtland about 20 years ago. And this kid told me the story about how the Central Planning Committee chose his town in some remote part of Russia to be the one town where all the winter coats in the entire country were going to be produced. One big winter coat factory. And all the winter coats in the entire Soviet Union were going to be produced in this one town. All the workers in that town worked at the factory. Everything was built around the winter coat factory in this particular town. And because the government's deciding your economic questions, the government doesn't, the government's not going to say, well, we should make pink coats with all kinds of decorations and black and white polka dot coats and coats with, thick down coats and thin coats. No. The government basically said, we're going to make two styles of coat, a blue one and a gray one. All right. And my former student told me the story. And if you've ever seen old pictures of the Soviet Union, you would see that that's so true. In the wintertime, everybody's wearing these winter coats, and you either have a blue one or you have a gray one. And why is that? It's because the customers don't choose what gets made and how it gets made. The government chooses what gets made and how it gets made. So the keys to communism, by the way, that's, if you haven't figured out, that's the most popular nickname for the command economy is communism. Central Planning Committee decides the three economic questions. The government owns all the means of production. The government owns the stores, the factories. The government owns the land, the agriculture, all of that is owned by the government. And in order for this to work, and here's where, we even get to the point where we say communism is evil or even socialism. In order to force people to be equal, like communism would dictate, you have to have authoritarian or totalitarian rule, meaning you have to tell people they're going to work in this factory and they're going to live in this town, and everybody's going to make the same amount of wages. And it's not good because it kills innovation and it kills motivation. If I know I'm being forced to work here or work there, and everybody else I work with is making the same wages as me, then I have no motivation to innovate, try to get better at what I do, or maybe study and improve my lot in life by going to college or whatever. The government decides all these economic questions. It's very utopian. I'm not going to get back to Karl Marx and Marxist theory, but it sounds great to say, well, the workers will own everything and the workers will share equally in the bounty of the production. But it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work because some people we're humans. We're unequal. We have envy in our mind. We want to be better than the next person. We can't be forced to be equal. And this is what a command economy would dictate. Obviously, some sample command economies. You've heard of the infamous North Korea. We're going to watch a North Korea documentary a little bit later on in class. Haiti, Iran, Cuba, and a few others. Vietnam is slowly transitioning away from communism. China is slowly transitioning away from communism. And this leads us into mixed economies. Most countries of the world are not going to be, they're going to be a mix. There's going to be some government intervention, and there's going to be aspects of capitalism as well, the market and the command economies. Sometimes we use the word socialism as kind of this intermediary between capitalism and communism. But it's by degree. It's how socialist are you or how capitalist are you. So most countries of the world are indeed mixed economies. Most adults that I talk to still believe that, China would be categorized as a communist country. I don't believe that's true. It's a very socialist country. But China is embracing private ownership, capitalism, disparate wealth, just like a lot of other countries are. They still have a lot of political restrictions, like no freedom of speech and freedom of press and things like that in China. But as far as the economy, it's slowly becoming very mixed, less communist and more capitalist. So if you could take the history of economics and just condense it into, if I'm going to give a 2-minute lesson on the history of economics, and I could give you 3 authors and 3 books, this is the chart that I'd like you to write down into your notes. And what's really cool is I'm not going to make you remember or memorize or write down specific dates, but just general ideas. So first guy is Adam Smith. He's on the left in this picture. He lived in the 1700s. Second guy is Karl Marx. He lived in the 1800s. And then the last guy is Upton Sinclair. He really wasn't an economic philosopher. He was more of a muckraker, if you remember from my history class, or a consumer journalist. But his influence was very strong, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So Adam Smith, he was from Scotland. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and it really promoted the ideas of what we now know as capitalism. And he analyzed, why are some countries rich and why are some countries poor? And logic would dictate, and the thought was always that, well, countries that have more resources, larger countries, will be rich. Smaller countries with less resources will be poor. But he found that they couldn't be further from the truth. A small country like Great Britain or England, and his own country, Scotland, had great wealth. Great Britain was one of the greatest countries in the world at the time that Adam Smith lived. And what was it that was causing this? And he analyzed, and he really found that if you could look at freedom, economic freedom, the more freedom a country had, the more wealthy everybody in the country was in general. All right. The less freedom a country had, the more poor everybody in the country was. All right. And so this book became The Wealth of Nation and the birth of the ideas of what we now call capitalism. Completely opposite comes along Karl Marx, a German philosopher. He wrote the book, The Communist Manifesto, a very famous guide to communism, if you will. And he thinks that unbridled capitalism, the ideas of Adam Smith are bad, and it's going to lead to class struggle and the rich versus the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and that the only way that history can right itself through constant revolution and struggle is through making everybody equal. And so these are the beginning ideas of communism. And then the third gentleman here, third writer, is Upton Sinclair. And you might remember him from The Jungle, the book that we talk about in history class. And we would call him a socialist, and he really saw the unbridled capitalism of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And if you know the story, he analyzed the meatpacking industry, and that what was happening with pure, unbridled, unregulated capitalism is workers were being taken advantage of, dangerous working conditions. The food that was being produced in these factories was not sanitary, not healthy. The pay was terrible. So all these side problems, when you have an unregulated economy, were occurring. And so these are the beginnings of the idea that, hey, we should have some freedoms and some private ownership, and the government should stay out of a lot of things, but also the government should be involved in a lot of things, and we should have a lot of regulation as well. And so I'm going to show you this video a little bit later on. We're going to look at the circular flow diagram here. The circular flow diagram is basically, here's the fancy picture. On the left, you've got households. On the right, you've got firms or companies. And this is kind of what it looks like. So here's households. And this is a snapshot of what an economy basically looks like. So how do households make their money? All right. They provide labor to firms, to companies. So households, people work, provide their labor to firms. Firms pay them wages. Well, where do the people, what do they do with their money? Well, they spend their money on firms, on companies. And what do the companies provide for you in exchange for that payment? Goods and services. All right. So now we have lots of options. We don't always have to shop at the place that we work. So this is just a simplistic model of the circular flow diagram of the United States or any capitalist country. So I work for a company, the company pays me money, I spend that money in the economy, and they provide goods and services, and there's a flow of goods and services and labor, and then there's this outside flow of money that goes from wages to payments for goods and services. And we've got these other little side things going on because people don't all spend all their money. They save some of it. And then there's banks that turn around and invest loan money to firms to be able to grow. And so it's not as complicated. It's a little bit more complicated than what initially we see there. And so in a mixed economy, we have to add the government. And there's many circular flows with the government. Some people work for the government. Some people pay taxes to the government. The government, we get goods and services back, like police protection, fire protection, roads, education, and so forth. So we get these many circular flows between the government and households and the government and firms as well. And in a communist country, that government is, there is no firms. All the firms are owned by the government. So in a communist country, command economy, everybody, all the citizens work for the government, and the government decides how much they're going to pay you. And then you turn right around and you will buy things from the government, like that bread store, that government-owned bread store you saw earlier in this chart. In communist countries, all the stores are owned by and run by the government. So you go to the government bread store, get some bread. You leave the bread store, you go to the clothing store, the shoe store, you get some shoes. There's like stores for all the different products that the government thinks that you need. Okay, I'm going to skip this Earth Lights. Well, I'm not going to skip. I'm going to show you guys this. This is not in your slide, but if you could roughly equate electricity use to a country's wealth, and you can for the most part. The richer countries will use more electricity. The poorer countries will use less electricity. Now, of course, you're not going to get much electricity in the Amazon rainforest. Hardly anybody lives there. And the Sahara Desert, hardly anybody lives there. All right, so this might look poor. It is poor, but it's also because there's nobody that lives there. All right, What's really telling is you've got the eastern United States, and you see how much population and wealth we have there. All right. And this is probably only about 150 million people. 10 times that amount of people live here in India. All right. Now, what does that tell you about India? All right. So 1 billion or more people live here, and about 150 million live here. 10 times the people live here. And you see how that's not very well lit up. All right. So this roughly equates to a country's wealth. You look at Japan here. Japan, I talked about this the other day in class. Japan is a pretty wealthy country per capita, and you see it's very well lit up. But I want to draw your attention to this island off the coast of Japan right here. I'm going to zoom in, and when we zoom in, you're going to see that's not really an island. Here's Japan, this long island, chain of islands. And then this is South Korea. This is not an island. This is South Korea. This dark area is North Korea, right? North Korea, communist country. Vietnam, communist country. All right. If I were to zoom back out to Cuba over here, communist country. All right. Not a lot of wealth going on. Are they all equal? Yes, but they're equally poor. So I want to switch gears here and give you an example of what happened when you have lots of government involvement in the economy versus less government involvement in the economy. During the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, he was the governor of California, and he took office based on a campaign promise that he was going to deregulate a lot of industries. He believed that our country at that time was very socialist, that we had way too much government involvement in particular, the airline industry. And I remember growing up and talking to my parents, and we could not afford to fly anywhere. It was very expensive. Even with the cost of living changing and inflation, $1,000, plane tickets were $1,000 in the 80s, all right? That's a lot of money now. It was a lot of money in the 80s. And it was pretty safe. Nationally, we would average about one plane crash per every 5 years. Now, to you, you're going like, oh, man, that's too many. One per every 5 years, that's still way too many. But actually, in the grand scheme of how many flights we have in this country every day, that was pretty good. And the reason why is because we were highly regulating the airline industry. And look over here, this plane is getting a de-icing chemical, a de-icing compound, all right? And they had to, the law said they had to de-ice, and a mechanic, an airline mechanic, had to inspect the engine after every single flight. So after every single flight, they had the expense of this de-icing compound and a mechanic's inspection. Imagine if every time you drove your car, you had to have it inspected by a mechanic. All right, that's how frustrating the airline industry was. It added a lot of cost to flying. So Reagan deregulated and took some of these rules off, or at least lightened a lot of these rules. Unfortunately, because there's trade-offs, now we are getting one crash every year. That doesn't sound great, but ticket prices dropped to about $200 for an airline flight. They went from 1,000 to 200. All right, so now we look at the trade-off. Now I want to say to you realistically, what would you rather have? Would you rather have the $1,000 airline tickets and one crash every 5 years? Or would you rather have $200 airline tickets and on average about one big crash per year? And some of you will answer, I'll take the $1,000 tickets. Others of you will say, I'll take the risk. I'll take the $200 tickets, the cheap tickets. I'll fly a lot more often. And yeah, I'm taking a risk that I might crash. All right, but the risk of actually dying in a plane is very, very low. Here's an old newspaper article that talked about how airline prices fell and really nobody noticed. And a lot of that was from the deregulation of the airline industry. You see here, 1980, Reagan, all right, and how the cost of flying has gotten so low. And, and yes, we still have accidents, but the chance of you being killed driving your car on the way to school is a lot higher than it is taking a plane somewhere. All right. And so that was a trade-off Americans were willing to take. Because really, realistically, let's think about this for a moment. What about these 26,000 dead people? These 26,000 deaths in automobiles and trucks? Don't we want to lower that number, or don't we care about that number? All right. Because Mr. P, I could get rid of this. All right. If you really want to get rid of aviation deaths and automobile deaths, which one are you going to focus on? The 548 that die every year in a plane, or the 26,000 accidents in automobiles and trucks? All right, I'm going to focus on this one. And if I'm president of the United States, I'm going to solve that problem tomorrow. I'm going to just sign an executive order that says that all speed limits in the United States shall be 5 miles per hour. Would that solve it? Yes, nobody would die. Would everybody be upset because they now have to drive 5 miles per hour? Yes. They would say, I'll take the 26,000 crashes a year. Let me drive 55, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. All right. And the same sort of concept you have to apply to aviation. All right. We are willing to accept a certain amount of death and crashes through deregulation, unregulating, taking more government away from business and industry and allowing them to do their thing. Or we could make it completely safe. Right? Like I said, how could I get rid of 26,000 car accidents per year? One way I could do it is just lower the speed limit, but nobody's willing to do that. Don't you care about dead people? All right. And if you're the type of person that says, well, I want my speed limit to be 80, then I would say you don't care about dead people. I'm joking. All right. You do, but you know, it's a trade-off. Here's another graphic that shows this in a little bit better way. You know, the deadliest thing out there is motorcycles, then cars, then ferries, ferry boats, trains, and then look at airplanes. All right. Deaths per 1 billion passenger miles. You are way, way, way more likely to die in an automobile than you are in an airplane. And that's just statistical reality of the situation. I'm going to show you a video of this. This is kind of cool. People don't realize how many planes fly in a 24-hour period in the world. And each one of these yellow dots you'll see on the video represents a plane flying from one place to another place. And we are going to watch a little bit later on a documentary from National Geographic about North Korea and communism, command economy. And closing comments here from Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman. Quote, a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. And Milton Friedman, he's now dead, but he was a very influential economist. And it is this trade-off between, do we want people to be economically equal, or do we want high degrees of freedom? Because you can't have both. Mr. P signing off.